December 11, 1941, the day the radio fell silent. The area in the Abwehr office that morning was thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic hum of machines. I sat before my receiver, transcribing intercepted reports from Washington, the steady rhythm of and translation filling the sterile silence. Then the radio crackled, the Führer's rising like thunder through every speaker in Berlin. Germany declares war on the United States of America. The words struck harder than any explosion. Around me, men stood at attention, some cheering, others stunned. I kept my head down, but my hand trembled. I knew what it meant, not victory, but ruin. I had seen enough secret cables, enough intercepted dispatches, to understand what the Americans were capable of. Their industry, their ships, their oil. The Reich was walking into a firestorm it could never contain. That night, the city roared with propaganda and celebration, fireworks streaking about blacked-out rooftops as if to deny the fear beneath. But I could hear the undertone in the cheers, desperation disguised as faith. We had triumphed across Europe, yes, but at what cost? Our men were buried from the Baltic to the Balkans. And now, another giant had entered the field. In my office, the radio kept repeating the declaration, like a curse. Each repetition made my stomach twist tighter. I thought of the diplomats in Washington I had met before my return, the coded exchanges, the careful balance that had held until now. Everything had changed in a single sentence. The Americans would not negotiate. They would fight, and they would not stop. I took the latest intercept from my desk. It was a report from our own analysts. The U.S. Navy had already mobilized carriers in the Pacific. Their intelligence network was expanding in Europe. And within our own walls, whispers spread that the Abwehr itself was no longer trusted. Orders were being redirected to the Gestapo, the shadow tightening around all of us. When I left the building, snow was beginning to fall over Wilhelmstrasse. Soldiers marched past in perfect rhythm, their boots striking the frozen ground with mechanical precision. Their faces were young, unscarred, untouched by doubt. I envied them, their certainty, their blindness. That night I could not sleep. The city's air raid sirens wailed in the distance, drills for the inevitable attacks to come. I turned on the radio again, not to listen but to confront the voice that had sealed our fate. It was replaying Hitler's speech, the same conviction, the same madness. For the first time since the war began, I felt something break inside me. It was not fear, nor guilt, it was realization. I had dedicated my life to decoding lies, to hiding truths inside numbers and phrases. But this truth was plain, unencrypted, impossible to deny. Germany had just declared war on the world. The clock struck midnight, the radio went silent. I stared at the blank dial, its faint orange glow fading like the last breath of a dying machine. Outside, snowflakes drifted past my window, soundless and cold. Somewhere in the city, bells rang faintly, the echo of a nation celebrating its own undoing. That was the moment I understood. Wars are not lost on battlefields. They are lost in decisions made by men who cannot see beyond their own power. And on December 11, 1941, as Berlin cheered, I sat alone at my desk and realized, our war was already over. December 12, 1941, the secret order. At dawn, the corridors of the Abwehr headquarters were colder than the streets outside. I arrived to find a sealed envelope on my desk, unmarked, except for the black eagle stamped in wax, no sender, no signature. Only one line scrawled across the front in hurried ink. Immediate assignment, Lisbon, Lisbon. A neutral city, a nest of spies from every nation pretending to sip coffee in peace, the perfect graveyard for men like me. I tore open the envelope, expecting routine diplomatic instructions, coded phrases, identification protocols, perhaps a list of local contacts. But inside, there was something else, a single page, covered in numbers that formed a pattern I knew too well. The cipher was internal, one used only for surveillance operations. We were to watch our own men. The realization crawled down my spine like ice. The Abwehr, once proud of its independence from the party's grip, was beginning to devour itself. There were whispers that Admiral Canaris himself was under suspicion, that loyalty to the Reich now meant loyalty to madness. By midday, I was summoned to the office of Colonel Reiser. He looked exhausted, the deep lines around his eyes etched by years of pretending to believe. "You leave tonight," he said without looking up. "Diplomatic cover. Standard courier clearance." His tone betrayed something more. Fear, perhaps pity. He slid a second envelope toward me. "Destroy this after reading. Inside were the details, my mission. Monitor the activities of our attaches in Lisbon, especially one code N and FOC. There were no explanations, only a warning. Do not trust anyone outside of your direct channel." It was not an assignment, it was a test of loyalty. That night, I boarded the transport train bound for Paris, my false documents secured beneath my coat. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against the rails drowned out my thoughts, but not the unease pressing on my chest. Every man in the carriage wore a uniform, every glance felt like scrutiny. I began to wonder how many of us were spies, and how many were simply being watched. At the border, the Gestapo officers inspected my papers. One of them lingered too long on my photograph, his gloved finger tracing the stamp beside my name. "Abwehr," he muttered, as if the word itself left a bad taste. Then, without another word, he handed it back and motioned me through. His eyes followed me until I disappeared into the next carriage. By the time we reached the coast, night had swallowed the world. The port smelled of diesel, salt, and fear. I boarded the freighter under my alias, a low-level diplomatic courier. As the engines rumbled to life, I watched the black outline of France recede into the fog. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Portugal, and perhaps my own death. In my cabin, I opened the coded message once more and read it under the dim light. A single phrase repeated near the end of the cipher caught my eye. "Observe for contamination." I knew the term. It was used for ideological infection, doubt, sympathy for the enemy, or refusal to follow orders. I folded the paper and burned it in an ashtray, watching the flame consume every number, every secret. The smoke curled upward like a ghost, vanishing into the darkness above. As I lay back, the hum of the engines reminded me of the radio static in Berlin. Orders, lies, voices, all blending into one endless noise. And in that noise, I began to hear something else, the quiet, relentless whisper of suspicion. We were no longer fighting the Allies, we were fighting ourselves. December 18, 1941. The man who knew my real name. The morning fog hung thick over Lisbon's harbor, turning the ships into gray silhouettes and the water into a sheet of dull silver. I stood at the edge of the docks, clutching a leather briefcase that contained nothing but false documents and invisible danger. The city smelled of salt, oil, and the perfume of secrets, the kind that could kill a man without a sound. I had been in Lisbon only 2 days, enough to understand why everyone called it the capital of silence. Every face seemed to belong to someone pretending to be someone else. At the cafes, men in British coats read German newspapers. In the alleys, Portuguese policemen whispered in French. I moved through it all like a ghost, careful to leave no trace. That morning, I was to meet an officer from the Kriegsmarine, my supposed contact, though the Abwehr file had given me no name. Only the code. Cistern. He was to deliver new encryption keys for our Lisbon station. Routine, they said, but nothing felt routine anymore. He arrived late, a tall man in a dark naval coat, his boots echoing against the wet planks. His cap was pulled low, shadowing his face. When he reached me, he extended his hand. Firm, disciplined. Then he spoke. "Guten Morgen, Herr Kruger." My blood froze. That was my real name. Not the alias printed in my papers, not the identity had been living under since 1939. Only two people in Berlin still knew it. And one of them was dead. I forced a nod, concealing the tremor in my voice. "You must be Cistern," I said. He smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't. "Names don't matter here," he replied. "Only loyalty." Then he handed me a sealed envelope and turned as if to leave. Before I could respond, the sound tore through the morning. A single gunshot, sharp and hollow, swallowed by the fog. Cistern staggered forward, clutching his chest. His cap fell to the ground, rolling toward the edge of the dock. He didn't speak again. Instinct took over. I dropped behind a crate, drawing the small pistol hidden inside my coat. But there was no second shot, no movement, only the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the mist. When I reached Cistern's body, his lifeless eyes stared upward, glassy and calm, as if he had expected it. The envelope he'd given me was still in his hand. I pried it loose, blood staining the paper. Inside, there were no encryption keys. Only a single photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, of me walking through Wilhelmstrasse 2 weeks earlier. On the back, one line written in German, "He no longer serves the Reich." I stood there, frozen, the sound of sirens beginning to rise from somewhere inland. The shooter was gone, but the message was clear. I was not the hunter anymore, I was the prey. As dockworkers and police arrived, I slipped away into the labyrinth of narrow streets that twisted up from the harbor. The city seemed to close around me, every shadow watching, every window whispering. I could feel eyes on me, perhaps British, perhaps German, perhaps both. By the time I reached my rented apartment near Rue das Geniales Verdes, the photograph was crumpled in my hand. I burned it in the stove, but the words remained burned into my mind. Someone had betrayed me, or worse, someone had decided I was no longer useful. That night, as I stared out the window toward the black waters of the Tagus River, I thought again of Berlin, of that moment when the radio fell silent. I had believed the war was lost because of decisions made by generals and dictators. Now I understood the truth. Wars are lost in whispers, long before the battles begin. December 21, 1941. The silence of the neutrals. Lisbon pulsed like a heartbeat caught between two worlds, one bleeding, the other pretending not to see. From the windows of the German embassy, the city looked peaceful. Trams clattering past cafes, fishermen hauling nets, sunlight glinting off tiled facades. But beneath the calm, every corner breathed deception. The air itself seemed to listen. I walked the marble corridors that morning with the stiffness of a hunted man. The shooting at the docks was officially an accident, the report said. I was ordered to remain silent, to continue my duties without deviation. No one asked about the missing officer, and I didn't dare mention that he had known my real name. In Lisbon, silence was courtesy, and I was learning to pay in fear. Inside the embassy, our so-called diplomats were spies draped in protocol. They smiled over tea with British envoys, traded coded glances with Americans, and toasted neutrality as if it were a shield. Yet beneath their polished shoes were cracks spreading through the floor of the Reich. I read it in their eyes, panic behind civility. We were men serving a machine that no longer trusted itself. Every night, I decoded messages arriving from Berlin, each one colder than the last. Orders layered with contradictions, reports praising victories that hadn't happened. And always, the demand for absolute loyalty. The words had begun to lose meaning, hollowed out by the quiet dread that filled every office. In cafes along the Avenida da Liberdade, I observed my supposed allies, men who once shouted Sieg Heil now whispering over coffee, their hands trembling as they discussed escape routes, new identities, Swiss visas. They wore smiles for the Portuguese and silence for one another. I mirrored them perfectly. The British were everywhere. You could hear them before you saw them, that clipped laughter, those sharp eyes measuring every gesture. And the Americans had arrived too, under the veil of neutrality. Commercial representatives, they called themselves, but their briefcases carried radios, not contracts. Even the waiters seemed to know who worked for whom. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and you vanished into the night. Once, near the Rossio Square, I saw a Soviet contact I had met years before in Stockholm. He didn't acknowledge me. We passed like strangers, to ghosts sharing a secret graveyard. The fear in his eyes mirrored mine, not fear of death, but of discovery. Each night, I returned to my small flat overlooking the Tagus River, where coded transmissions crackled through a portable receiver. The sounds of war filled the static. Bombs over London, gunfire in the desert, voices breaking through the ether. I would lower the volume until it was barely audible and sit in the darkness, listening. Sometimes I imagined that, beneath the chaos, there was another signal, a faint rhythm, the heartbeat of a dying empire. The worst part was the quiet. The Portuguese did not speak of war. They watched, smiled, and carried on, pretending their country stood untouched. But neutrality was an illusion. Gold from Germany passed through their banks. British intelligence slipped through their ports. And in between them all, we, the Germans, lingered like wolves pretending to be diplomats. One evening, I attended a reception at the German legation. Wine flowed, music played, and the ambassador gave another hollow speech about inevitable victory. I looked around the room and saw faces lit by chandeliers, pale, strained, already fading. The sound of laughter felt like a funeral dirge. As I left the reception, the night air hit me with the chill of truth. Across the river, the lights of Lisbon shimmered like false stars over black water. For a moment, I envied the city, its illusion of peace, its chosen blindness, but I knew better. The silence of the neutrals was not peace, it was waiting. And somewhere in that waiting, the war was already deciding who would live, and who would simply disappear. December 27, 1941. The message I never sent. The rain came down hard that night, drumming against the embassy windows as if the city itself wanted to drown our secrets. I sat alone in the communications room, the smell of damp cables and hot metal filling the air. The others had gone. Diplomats drinking their illusions at the Hotel of Ease, officers whispering in back rooms, leaving me with nothing but static, codes, and the weight of what I was about to transmit. The message came through Lisbon's intercept channel shortly after midnight. Routine at first glance, encrypted chatter between Berlin and Madrid. But one phrase caught my eye. Operation Pacific confirmed. American fleet struck at Pearl Harbor, December 7th. I froze. That was 2 weeks ago. The world already knew. But then came the line that turned my blood to ice. Contact within U.S. diplomatic circle had prior knowledge of the attack. Prior knowledge. The words pulsed like a heartbeat across the page. The implication was impossible, monstrous. If true, it meant that the attack, the spark that had dragged America into the war, was not surprise, but strategy. And someone, somewhere, had played both sides. Protocol demanded I forward the message to Berlin immediately. I placed it in the encryption tray, prepared the transmission sheet, and hesitated. My hand refused to move. I kept hearing the gunshot in the fog, the officer calling me by my real name. If that report reached the wrong hands, it would vanish, and so would I. The typewriter waited, its keys gleaming under the lamplight. I could almost hear Berlin's voice in the static. Send it, agent, obey. But another voice, quieter, human, whispered something else. Don't let them bury another truth. I sat there for hours, the rain drowning out my thoughts. I tried to convince myself it was just propaganda, a fabrication from the British, a trick to sow division. Yet, deep inside, I knew the Abwehr had intercepted it from a German source. Someone within our own ranks was questioning the war, or exposing it. At dawn, I walked to the window. The city was still asleep, wrapped in mist. Across the river, faint church bells rang, indifferent to empires collapsing. I thought of the men in Berlin who would read my silence as betrayal, and I wondered if that would be the moment they marked me for death. I returned to the machine. The transmission sheet was still blank, my signature space untouched. I took the cable, folded it carefully, and slipped it inside my coat pocket. Then I opened the burner drawer, lit a match, and watched the flame crawl across the edge of the page. The coded words curled and blackened, turning to ash. Prior knowledge, gone, but the meaning remained, carved into my mind like a scar. By the time the others arrived, I had rewritten the report, a neutral summary, stripped of implication, sanitized for comfort. No mention of American contacts, no trace of the truth. When I handed it in, my superior simply nodded, unreadable. That night, I walked through the rain-soaked streets of Lisbon, the river glimmering like liquid steel beneath the lamps. I thought of the men fighting in the east, freezing in Russia, dying for victories already lost. And I thought of this message, the one I had never sent, and the secret it carried, now lost to smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, a car engine started and idled for too long. I felt eyes on me again, the familiar cold prickle of surveillance. I kept walking, hands in my coat pockets, heartbeat steady. In a war built on lies, silence had become my only weapon, and my greatest sin. January 3, 1942. The woman from Café Kyoto. The Café Kyoto was always alive with laughter, writers, diplomats, spies pretending to be one or the other. The war never crossed its doors, only rumors did, carried on cigarette smoke and the clinking of porcelain cups. I went there often, not for the coffee, but because it was the only place in Lisbon where I could pretend, for an hour, to be no one. That afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining like polished glass. I took my usual seat by the window, my briefcase resting beside me, and ordered a bica. I hadn't been there 10 minutes when she appeared, a woman in a gray coat, dark hair tied neatly beneath a hat, eyes sharp enough to cut through my false calm. She smiled as if we'd met before. "Do you mind if I join you?" she asked in perfect Portuguese. But when I nodded, she switched to German, clean, precise, with a Bavarian accent. "You're a long way from home, Herr Kruger." The cup in my hand nearly slipped. My alias had vanished again, torn away like a mass. She knew, and she didn't care who heard. "I believe you're mistaken," I said quietly. She smiled again, this time with something like pity. "No, I'm not." Her voice softened. "Berlin sent you here to watch your own men. But tell me, who's watching you?" I searched her face for clues. Intelligence agent, double, trap. Her eyes held no fear, only certainty. And something deeper, almost sorrow. "Who are you?" I asked. "Isabel," she said simply, as if that name alone carried its own secrets. "Let's say I'm interested in people who still have a conscience." She reached for her cup, her hand steady, elegant. I noticed a small scar near her wrist, the kind left by a gun's recoil. Before I could respond, she leaned closer. "You've seen things you're not supposed to see, messages you shouldn't have read. You're not the only one questioning the Reich, Herr Kruger. But be careful, doubt is fatal to your kind." The air between us thickened. For a moment, all the noise in the cafe faded. The laughter, the clatter, the soft music. Only her words remained, echoing in my chest. She stood to leave, leaving a few coins on the table. "When you start seeing ghosts in the mirror," she said, "it means the war has already taken your soul." I watched her walk away, her coat blending into the crowd, until she disappeared near the tram stop. For a few seconds, I wondered if she had been real at all. Then I noticed the folded napkin she had left on her saucer. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single note, written in neat German. "Not all your enemies are on the other side of the war." I folded it once, twice, then slipped it into my wallet beside a photograph of my brother, who had fallen in Poland 2 years earlier. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, the radio hummed softly in the corner, and I kept hearing her voice, calm, unwavering, warning me. The next morning, I went back to the cafe. Her table was empty. The waiter said she hadn't returned. No one there had seen her before. Not the barista, not the man at the counter, not even the doorman. It was as if Isabel had never existed, but the napkin was still in my pocket, real and undeniable. From that day on, I stopped trusting the silence. In Lisbon, silence meant danger. And now, it had a name. January 10, 1942. The ship that never sailed. The harbor smelled of oil and rot. Dawn crept over the water like smoke, pale and weak. I had orders to deliver a sealed package aboard a German freighter bound for Hamburg. Diplomatic cargo, the papers said. But the sea that morning felt wrong. Even before I reached the docks, I could hear shouts carried by the wind, the sharp crack of something breaking. When I turned the corner, I saw the flames. The freighter, hence a knot, was burning from the inside out, thick black columns twisting toward the sky. Men ran in chaos, their uniforms half hidden by the smoke. I froze, briefcase still in hand, watching our supposed escape to Germany dissolve into fire. Then, through the haze, I saw him, the man from Berlin, the same officer who had handed me my Lisbon orders weeks earlier. His uniform was torn, his face blackened with soot, but I recognized his eyes. He stared straight at me across the inferno, and in that moment, I understood. He hadn't come to save the ship. He had come to make sure it never left. A second explosion ripped through the hull. The blast threw me backward against a crate, my ears ringing, my vision blurred. When I lifted my head again, the officer was gone. Only the burning ship remained, glowing like a pyre. I stumbled to my feet and ran, blending into the panic as Portuguese firefighters arrived, their hoses hissing uselessly against the flames. My hand shook as I felt for the package inside my coat. The wax seal was still unbroken. Whatever was inside, documents, names, evidence, had just cost several men their lives. By nightfall, the newspapers claimed it was an accidental fire, likely caused by fuel leakage. But I knew better. The Hansenaut had been silenced before it could speak. And whoever had lit that fire had done so to erase something far greater than cargo. That night, I hid the package beneath the floorboards of my flat. I poured a drink with trembling hands and stared out over the Black River, where smoke still lingered on the horizon. Somewhere in that darkness, someone was cleaning up loose ends. And I had just watched my own escape burn to ashes. January 14, 1942. The Voices from London. 3 days later, I intercepted a British broadcast meant to be jammed before reaching occupied Europe. I listened in the dark, the receiver hissing, the voice faint but steady. Reports from the Eastern Front indicate catastrophic German losses near Moscow. Supply lines frozen, morale collapsing, but then came something that turned my stomach. And new intelligence from inside the Reich confirms compromised Abwehr communications. Berlin's walls are bleeding secrets. They knew about us. About me. About everything. I increased the volume, straining to catch every word. The announcer mentioned Operation Barbarossa by name. Details of troop movements, casualty numbers, all accurate, all impossible for the British to know unless someone inside Germany was feeding them. The voice continued, colder now, not all traitors, wear the enemy's uniform. I switched off the radio, my hand trembling. For a moment, I sat there in silence, my reflection flickering in the window. Pale, hollow eye, unrecognizable. The words echoed inside my skull. Not all traitors wear the enemy's uniform. Was that what I had become? Or was I merely surviving a war that had already devoured the truth? Later that night, I walked through the rain toward the river. Lisbon glowed faintly behind me, a city of lights built on shadows. Every reflection in the puddle seemed like a signal, every silhouette a watcher. I could almost hear Berlin breathing down my neck, demanding obedience. But all I could think about was that British voice, calm, factual, merciless. They didn't sound like victors, just witnesses. Witnesses to a Reich already bleeding out from within. January 20, 1942. The Broken Mirror. The order arrived sealed in red wax. Internal inquiry. Agent reassignment. Priority level. Critical. I read it twice, each word cutting deeper. The directive came from Berlin itself. My new task was to investigate leaks within the Abwehr network, to find the traitor responsible for the flow of information reaching the Allies. There was a list of names attached, stamped top secret. I unfolded it slowly. The third name on the page was mine. For a long time, I didn't move. Outside, church bells marked the hour, their sound distant and hollow. My reflection in the window stared back, fractured by a crack in the glass. Two faces, one loyal, one condemned. I burned the document immediately, but the knowledge remained. They were turning inward, consuming their own. The Gestapo's shadow was already creeping into the Abwehr. And I had become the perfect scapegoat, a man too silent, too uncertain, too aware. That evening, I walked to a small bar near the docks where spies and deserters met under false names. I ordered a drink and waited. Around me, laughter echoed. Nervous, forced. Every face seemed to hide a lie. When I caught my reflection again in the bar's mirror, it was warped by a hairline crack running straight through the glass. Two versions of myself stared back, one obedient to Berlin, the other already condemned. I raised the glass in silence, a toast to ghosts. Somewhere, I was already dead. January 27, 1942. The portrait of Isabel. I found her again in a place where no one should have survived. A crumbling hotel, by the river, filled with refugees who spoke in whispers and slept with their papers under their pillows. The war had turned them into shadows of nations that no longer existed. I had come to deliver a message to a contact from Vichy, France. Instead, I found Isabel. She was sitting by the window, the morning light outlining her like smoke. When she saw me, she didn't smile. "You look worse than when I last saw you," she said. Her voice carried neither mockery nor affection, only exhaustion. "I thought you had disappeared," I said. "I did," she replied, and motioned for me to sit. The room smelled of damp, tanned despair. On the table between us lay a stack of photographs, not of soldiers, but of civilians, emaciated faces behind barbed wire. Tits filled with bodies. I felt my stomach tighten. "This is what your country is doing," she said softly. "Not just fighting a war, building factories of death." I looked away. Propaganda, I muttered, though my voice betrayed me. She shook her head. You still want to believe that, don't you? That the machine you serve has limits, but it doesn't, it never did. She slid one of the photographs toward me. In it, a German officer, my uniform, stood beside a train, his face blurred, his hand pointing. It could have been anyone, it could have been me. I felt something fracture inside. Every mission, every coded message, every order, they all led here, to this. To silence, to obedience, to complicity. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because you still have something they've lost, she said. Tout. She reached into her coat and placed a small portrait on the table. A photograph of herself, younger, smiling, standing in Munich. If you live long enough to see Berlin burn, she whispered, remember this face. Remember that not all Germans believed the lies I left before the walls could close in around me. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the city oblivious. I carried the image of those photographs in my mind, ghosts etched in black and white. That night, I locked the door and sat in the dark, the radio silent. I realized then that there would be no redemption for men like me, only survival and the weight of memory. February 3, 1942, the Berlin Co. The coded transmission arrived at dawn, disguised as a weather report. I decrypted it line by line, my pulse quickening as the message revealed itself. Eliminate agents compromised by foreign powers, execute immediately. Authorization, Gestapo Directive 71B. Attached was a list of names. I didn't need to read to the end, mine was the first. The message had come from Berlin itself, routed through military channels. No mistakes, no misunderstanding, the Reich had turned its blade inward, and I was standing at its edge. I tore the paper to pieces, but it didn't matter. The message had already been received by others. I knew what would follow, a polite knock at the door, a request to clarify certain activities, then a quiet disappearance. I packed what little I had. False documents, cash, the photograph Isabel had given me, and left before sunrise. The streets were still, the city unaware of the execution list being written in secret. At the embassy gates, two officers I didn't recognize stood watch. Their faces were blank, their eyes fixed on me a second too long. I turned down another street, heading for the train station. My reflection in every shop window looked less like a man and more like a fugitive. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, the coded radio in my pocket hummed faintly, a single tone, repeating every few seconds. It was a tracking signal. They were already following me. I smashed it against the cobblestones, metal scattering like shrapnel, and ran toward the border roads where Spanish agents traded silence for gold. My only thought was escape, not to survive, but to vanish. I had spent years hiding behind false names. Now, I needed to kill the last one that remained. February 10, 1942, the train to Madrid. The train groaned as it crossed into Spain, the wheels clattering through the dark like a pulse barely holding on. I sat in the last carriage, surrounded by refugees, German officers out of uniform, French deserters, widows clutching bags filled with nothing but paper memories. No one spoke. Outside, the countryside stretched in shades of gray. The war had not touched this land yet, but it haunted every station, every checkpoint, every whispered prayer. I unfolded a Spanish newspaper someone had left behind. The headline stared back at me. United States declares war on Germany. No surprise, no outrage. Just confirmation of what I had known since that December morning when the radio fell silent in Berlin. The others read in silence, their faces expressionless. No one dared to speak the truth, that it was over. The Reich had declared war on the world, and the world had answered. The rhythm of the train lulled me into a strange calm. I thought of Isabel, of the burned ship, of the officers' eyes in the fire. I thought of the faces in those photographs. For the first time, I felt the weight of every coded lie I had ever transmitted. The war would go on for years, yes, men would still fight, cities would still burn, but the end had already been written. I could feel it in the silence of that carriage, in the way no one dared to meet another's eyes. When we reached Madrid, I stepped off without looking back. The night air was heavy with smoke and distant gunfire from border patrols. Spain was neutral in name only. Here, everything had a price. As I walked toward the city, I realized I was no longer a soldier, nor a spy. I was merely what remained after loyalty had died. February 16, 1942. The Blind General. Madrid was a city of whispers, where money replaced bullets and truth was traded like contraband. I found refuge in a crumbling villa owned by a retired general, a man whose blindness seemed to make him see more than any of us. His name was General Varela, a relic of Franco's war, living off favors and secrets. He greeted me with a glass of brandy and a knowing smile. "Another German seeking silence," he said. "You people always arrive when your empire begins to sink." His eyes, pale and milky, turned toward me as though they could still pierce my disguise. I told him I was a diplomat. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Diplomats don't carry revolvers, my friend. They carry excuses." He offered me a room and safety in exchange for information, not about battles or troop movements, but about intentions. "Who does Berlin fear most now?" he asked one night as we listened to the crackle of a shortwave radio. "Themselves," I answered. He chuckled. "Then your Reich has become like every empire before it." We listened to British broadcasts bleeding through the static, reports of new fronts opening, of Russian winter swallowing divisions whole. The general leaned back, glass in hand. "The Americans will break you," he said. "You've awakened a giant that doesn't tire." I looked at the floor, unable to argue. Before I left his study, he spoke again, a voice that felt like prophecy. "Germany dug its own grave, son. And you." He tapped the air toward me with a trembling hand. "You still hold the shovel." That night, I couldn't sleep. His words lingered long after the radio went silent. The war no longer felt like a battle of nations, but a lone suicide, a slow drowning led by blind men who mistook death for glory. February 22, 1942. The letters I burned. The letters came in a sealed packet smuggled through a contact at the embassy. Dozens of pages written by high-ranking officers, all marked strictly confidential. They spoke of something unspeakable: logistics, camps, final measures. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion, but I could feel the horror bleeding through the ink. I read them in silence, each page heavier than the last. It wasn't war, it was extermination, cold, organized, deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was a distortion, an exaggeration, but the signatures were real. Men I knew, men I had once admired. For hours, I stared at those letters, my hands shaking. I thought of Isabel's photographs, of the faces behind the barbed wire, and realized she had not been showing me propaganda, she had been showing me truth. When the sun began to rise, I gathered the letters and carried them to the fireplace, one by one. I fed them to the flames. The smoke curled upward, gray and silent, like the souls of those condemned by ink. I told myself I was protecting lives, I destroying them, that if the Gestapo found me with such evidence, I'd join the same fate as the people those papers condemned. But as the last page turned to ash, I knew I wasn't protecting anyone. I was simply hiding, the villa filled with the faint scent of burning paper and guilt. Outside, church bells rang, announcing another day of lies. March 1, 1942, the voice of guilt. Every night, I turned on the radio, not to listen, but to confront the echo of what I'd become. Propaganda flowed endlessly, promises of victory, of destiny, of sacrifice. The announcer's voice was calm, proud, blind. I'd switch it off and sit in the dark, hearing only my heartbeat. It had become my metronome of remorse. Each pulse reminded me of what I'd seen, what I'd burned, and what I'd chosen not to say. The general still entertained visitors, smugglers, agents, priests, all bargaining for the same currency, survival. I rarely spoke to any of them. Words had become dangerous, silence was safer. But silence carried its own poison. It followed me into my dreams, where I saw flames rising from Berlin, ships sinking beneath Atlantic waters, frozen soldiers staring with glassy eyes. I woke each morning drenched in sweat, unsure if the war outside or the one inside me was worse. One night, I turned the radio back on. The voice spoke of honor and sacrifice. I listened until I could bear it no longer, then smashed the dial with my fist. The glass shattered, and for the first time in months, there was no sound at all. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was confession. March 10, 1942. The map of ashes. The news came from the east, broken, incomplete, but enough to paint a portrait of ruin. I intercepted the reports through our fading network in Berlin, Stalingrad, a word that, at first, meant nothing more than another point on a map. But soon, it became a wound that bled through every line of transmission. Severe losses, the first message read. Extreme temperatures, supply breakdowns, then, as the weeks passed, the reports grew darker. Entire divisions trapped in snow, frozen bodies stacked like barricades. Commanders begging for fuel and food, while Berlin demanded victory speeches. From my small room in Madrid, I spread the maps across the table, black lines over white paper, tiny red pins marking the Eastern Front. Each one represented thousands of men, their lives reduced to dots. I moved one pin near the Volga River and thought of my brother, who had died in Poland before the world turned to ice. He was lucky, his war had been brief. The static of my receiver filled the silence. I caught fragments of intercepted transmissions, desperate German voices calling for reinforcements, for mercy. And beneath them, the confident, measured tone of Soviet intercepts. The tide had turned. One night, I traced the Volga with my finger, from north to south, until the line disappeared under a burn mark on the paper. I realized that the map was useless now. The lines had dissolved. The Reich's dream of conquest had turned into a graveyard drawn in ink-canned snow. I imagined the men there, frostbitten, starving, clinging to their rifles as the cold swallowed them whole. I had written their orders once, encoded their dispatches, turned their desperation into numbers. Now those numbers meant death. I poured a glass of brandy and stared at the fire in the hearth. The flames flickered against the map, turning the Volga black. I thought of Isabel, of the letters I had burned, of the men dying for orders born from lies. The truth was undeniable now. We had lost not because the enemy was stronger, but because our leaders had traded reason for madness. They sent woes to die in snowfields for an empire already collapsing under its own delusion. The radio crackled once more. A voice from Berlin, calm, rehearsed. Victory is imminent. The fatherland stands unbroken. I turned the volume down until the voice became a whisper, then silence. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. The Reich would fall. Not someday, soon. And when it did, it would leave behind nothing but ashes. March 20th, 1942. The last report. I knew it would be my final transmission. The decision came quietly, like the slow realization that one has been living as a ghost. The order from Berlin demanded an update, assessment of current Allied positions in Western Europe. I laughed when I read it. They still pretended that maps could change what was already lost. I sat at the desk, the typewriter gleaming under the lamplight. The machine waited, patient, like a confessor. I inserted the first sheet and began to type. Not what Berlin wanted, but what I needed to say. To the attention of the Abwehr Central Office, Berlin. This will be my final report. I wrote of the burned ship in Lisbon, the officer who knew my real name, the lists of traitors that had become a death sentence for patriots. I wrote of Isabel, of her photographs, of the letters detailing horrors our leaders called solutions. I wrote of Stalingrad, of frozen soldiers dying nameless beneath a sky that had forgotten them. Then I wrote the line that would seal my fate. The losses are irreparable. The war is no longer for victory, but for denial. The loyalty you ask for has already died. With the men who froze in Stalingrad, when I reached the end, I signed not with my own name, but with the cod name of an agent long dead. Fogg. Perhaps someone would believe it came from him. Perhaps no one would read it at all. It didn't matter. I encoded the message and sent it through a disused channel, knowing the signal would be traced, knowing my time had run out. Then, I turned off the transmitter and sat in the dark. Outside, Madrid was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Somewhere, church bells rang, slow and distant. For a long time, I listened to nothing. The hum of the wires, the ticking of the clock, the quiet heartbeat of a dying war. I had been many things: soldier, spy, liar, coward. But as I sealed that final message, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. If they found me, they would find only silence. And in that silence, perhaps, the truth would finally speak. April 12, 1942. The testimony. Years have passed since the last time I signed a report, but the memories have refused to fade. Even now, sitting in my small room overlooking Lake Geneva, the snow still carries the scent of Berlin smoke. The war has ended, they say, the borders are redrawn, the flags replaced, the uniforms buried. Yet for me, the war remains, not in the world, but in the silence that follows every thought. I live here under a name that was never mine. The papers say I am a clerk, a quiet man who reads old newspapers and never speaks of his past. But in the solitude of the nights, when the wind rattles the shutters and the church bell marks the empty hours, I return to the days when I believed in codes, in missions, in loyalty. I return to the sound of that radio in Berlin, to December 11, 1941, the day I realized that Germany had declared war not only on the world, but on itself. Sometimes I dream of the corridors of the Abwehr, the smell of carbon paper and sweat, the hum of the transmitters. I see the faces of the men who worked beside me, men who laughed, who trusted, who vanished without a word. Some of them went east, others disappeared into the cells of the Gestapo, none came back. We were taught to believe in duty, in destiny. What we served was madness disguised as order. The world today speaks of justice and rebuilding. They show photographs of trials, of men in gray suits insisting they did not know. I listen, and I remember the letters I burned in Madrid. Words that spoke of deportations, of processing, of efficiency. I knew. We all knew, but we told ourselves that duty was enough, that ignorance was safety. We hid behind the codes and the bureaucracy of death. And in that hiding, we became accomplices. I think of Isabel often. I never saw her again after that day in the refugee hotel. Sometimes I wonder if she survived. Other times I tell myself she didn't, that people like her never do. Yet her voice remains, cutting through the fog of memory. Not all enemies are on the other side of the war. She was right. My enemy wore my uniform, spoke my language, saluted my flag, and for too long, I had saluted back. When I first arrived in Switzerland, I promised myself I would forget. That I would live quietly, anonymously, and let the world rebuild without my confession. But silence has a way of turning into no's. The ghosts do not vanish. They only learn new ways to whisper. So tonight, I write this testimony, not to absolve myself, but to remember. I write because forgetting would be another betrayal. I write because the world must never mistake obedience for honor again. I remember Stalingrad, the endless snow, the intercepted cries for help. I remember the burning ship in Lisbon, the officer's lifeless eyes. I remember the coded order with my own name on it. I remember the faces in the photographs Isabel showed me, the faces of people who never had the chance to speak. I was a spy. I served a regime that called its lies truth and its crimes duty. I thought knowledge was power, but I learned too late that truth, when buried, becomes poison. It seeps through walls, through history, through memory, until there is no hiding from it. Outside my window, the lake lies calm beneath the mountains, reflecting the pale moonlight. The world looks peaceful again, but I know peace is just the silence that follows catastrophe. The kind of silence that once filled the Abwehr offices before the storm. If these pages are ever found, let them be a warning, not a plea. Let them speak for those who could not. I was a German spy. And on December 11, 1941, when the radio declared war on America, I heard something no one else did, the sound of a nation destroying itself. The war ended years ago, but I am still decoding its last message. It says, "No victory is worth a soul."